The night seemed peaceful at Tom Hanks's house. He was alone, sitting in his favorite armchair, absent-mindedly stroking his loyal Labrador, Thor. The silence of the house was only broken by the rustling of the trees outside and the soft sound of the dog's steady breathing, always alert. But in an instant, everything changed. A sharp pain shot through Tom's chest as if an invisible hand was squeezing his heart. His breath caught, and he tried to stand up, but his legs gave way. The cold floor was the last thing he felt before his vision went dark. Thor, who had been resting beside his owner, lifted his head and sniffed the air. Something was wrong. He moved closer, sniffing Tom's face, gently licking him as if trying to wake him up. But Tom didn't respond. What could a dog possibly do? Driven by an instinct beyond human understanding, Thor acted. But no one could have predicted what happened next. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment if you have a pet for more emotional and inspiring stories like this one. Tomorrow, we have another special story waiting for you. Tom Hanks's house was spacious, but not so grand that it felt impersonal. Every corner held memories. Every piece of furniture had meaning. The dark wooden bookshelf, for instance, was filled with books collected over the years, ranging from literary classics to movie scripts he had starred in. On the coffee table, a mug of coffee still exuded a faint aroma, blending with the house's woody scent. The living room was dimly lit, illuminated only by a soft lamp. The television was on, playing a talk show, but Tom wasn't paying attention. He was holding a book, but his mind wandered elsewhere. Thor, lying on the plush rug beside the sofa, watched his owner closely. He always noticed subtle changes in Tom's behavior. Humans might ignore certain signs from their bodies, but a dog never does. Thor's sharp senses could detect things invisible to human eyes, and he could sense the tension in the air before Tom himself even realized it. Tom sighed and ran a hand over his face. In recent months, he had been feeling more tired than usual. The intense filming schedules and constant travel had taken their toll. He had always been active, but lately, his body had been sending signals he stubbornly ignored. Outside, the night remained silent. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees, and a street lamp cast a faint glow over the house's entrance. The atmosphere was peaceful, yet carried an eerie sense of solitude. In the corner of the room, a red leash hung from a hook on the wall. It was Thor's, used for their morning walks that Tom loved. But that night, the dog didn't seem interested in resting. He was restless. His gaze followed his owner's every move, as if he knew something was about to happen. When Tom stood up to go to the kitchen, a slight dizziness made him grab the back of the sofa for support. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Thor noticed. He immediately lifted his head, ears pricked. Tom shook his head, brushing it off. "I'm just tired," he thought. He walked to the sink, filled a glass with water, and drank it slowly. But the discomfort in his chest lingered. A slight pressure, subtle but persistent. Returning to the living room, he sat down again and petted Thor's head. The dog closed his eyes for a moment, but his breathing remained fast. He sniffed the air, uneasy. The clock on the wall read 10:50 p.m. The house was quiet, too quiet. And then, within seconds, everything changed. Tom Hanks had always been known for his kindness, his charisma, and his ability to portray characters that touched the hearts of audiences. But behind the cameras, he was a simple man who valued family, friends, and the small moments in life. Despite his fame, he had never let stardom turn him into someone unreachable. He enjoyed walking down the streets without excessive security, having coffee at regular cafes, and chatting with strangers as if they were old friends. But that night, alone in his house, without his children, without his wife, without any commitments, he felt strangely vulnerable. It was rare for him to spend so much time without anyone around. While he appreciated solitude from time to time, he had always been surrounded by people. That night, everything felt different. Thor was his only companion, and that was enough. The dog knew him better than anyone. From the moment Thor was a puppy, Tom had sensed there was something special about him. Unlike other dogs, Thor didn't just follow commands. He seemed to understand emotions, pick up on moods, and noticed subtle changes. When Tom was happy, Thor celebrated with him. When he was sad, Thor stayed close, offering silent companionship. Tom remembered the day he brought Thor home. He had been just a clumsy puppy with paws too big for his small body. Back then, Tom was still juggling intense filming schedules and public events, but he always found time to play with and train the dog. Over time, Thor had grown into his inseparable companion. But now, as he got older, Tom found himself reflecting on life more than ever. The years had passed too quickly. He still felt young at heart, but his body was giving him signs that things were no longer the same. He thought about the messages from his wife, who always insisted he get regular checkups. "You work too much. You need to take care of your heart," she would say. He always responded with a smile and a dismissive wave. But deep down, he knew she was right. The question was, why did he keep ignoring the signs? Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the habit of believing there was always more time. Thor, lying at his feet, suddenly lifted his head. His eyes shone under the soft glow of the lamp. He sniffed the air as if sensing something invisible to anyone else. Tom, unaware of the dog's concern, placed a hand on his chest, feeling a slight pressure. It wasn't exactly pain, but a strange discomfort, as if something was off. He took a deep breath, trying to brush it off, but Thor knew. And that night, he would be the only one capable of saving his owner. Tom Hanks's life had always been intense. From a young age, he had been immersed in the world of cinema, dedicating himself entirely to every role he played. Time passed without him even noticing. From a young dreamer in Hollywood to one of the most respected actors in the industry, he had built a solid career filled with awards and recognition. But now, away from the film sets and without the spotlight, he was just a man alone in his house, surrounded by silence, feeling the weight of the years and the vulnerability of aging. Thor, on the other hand, didn't see Tom as a famous actor. To him, his owner was everything. The person who fed him, who took him on walks, who played with him and talked to him during quiet moments. Their bond went beyond words. When Tom sat on the couch and sighed in exhaustion, Thor would move closer and rest his head on his lap. When Tom laughed, the dog wagged his tail with excitement. And now, as Tom held his chest and tried to disguise his discomfort, Thor could sense something was wrong. The dog's restlessness grew. He didn't know what a heart attack was. He didn't understand the concept of a medical emergency, but his instincts told him to stay alert. Tom tried to distract himself. He grabbed the remote and changed the channel, but nothing seemed interesting. His eyes scanned the bookshelf, but he couldn't focus on reading. The pressure in his chest slowly began to intensify. Maybe it's just fatigue, he thought. A good night's sleep will fix this. But Thor wasn't convinced. He got up and moved closer, sniffing his owner's face. Tom smiled and ran a hand over the dog's head. "I'm fine, buddy. Just tired." Thor continued to stare at him, as if saying he didn't believe it. The clock read 11:05 p.m. The discomfort started turning into something more intense. Tom's breathing became slightly shallower. He furrowed his brow as sweat formed on his forehead. Thor noticed. And at that moment, he knew something was terribly wrong. His senses sharpened. He sniffed the air, let out a low bark, and began pacing restlessly around the living room. It was as if he could sense that his owner was in danger. Tom tried to stand up, but this time his legs gave out. He collapsed onto his knees on the rug, gasping. Thor rushed to him and started barking desperately. He had never acted like this before. Tom tried to speak, but no words came out. His heart was racing, the pain radiating down his left arm. He knew what was happening, but he was alone. Alone, except for Thor. And now, the dog had to do something he had never been trained for: save his owner's life. The pain intensified. Tom Hanks had never felt anything like this before. At first, it had just been a slight tightness in his chest, something he could have ignored as mere fatigue or stress. But now it felt as if an invisible hand were crushing his heart. His breath came in short gasps, and cold sweat trickled down his forehead. He tried to stand up again, but his legs refused to obey. He collapsed onto the soft rug in the living room, his breathing ragged. His entire body screamed for help, but he was alone. Alone. No, he wasn't. Thor was there. The dog, who had been restless moments before, was now in a state of total alertness. He moved closer, sniffing Tom's face, licking him as if trying to wake him. But Tom couldn't react. Thor let out a loud, desperate bark, but there was no one to hear it. He looked around as if searching for something, anything that could help. His instincts told him he had to act. But how? Thor was a trained dog, but never for situations like this. He had never been taught how to seek help for a heart attack, and yet, his instinct took over. He ran to the living room door and scratched at the wood with force, barking louder, but the door was closed. No one outside could hear him. He rushed back to Tom and, using his snout, tried to nudge him. Nothing. The dog began pacing back and forth, increasingly agitated, trying to understand what to do. Then, something caught his attention. Tom's cell phone was on the coffee table. Thor didn't understand technology, but he knew that whenever that device rang, Tom would pick it up to talk to someone. If only he could get the phone. Without hesitation, the Labrador jumped onto the couch and, with remarkable precision, used his snout to push the device off the table. The phone landed softly on the rug. Thor jumped down and, not quite knowing what he was doing, started pawing at the screen. He didn't know how, but he needed to activate the device. And then, by some stroke of fate, an emergency call was placed. The phone automatically dialed the last number called Tom's wife. The call was answered almost immediately. "Tom?" Her voice came from the other end. "Tom, is everything okay?" But there was no response, only the sound of Thor panting and barking. "Tom? What's going on?" A chill ran down her spine. Something was wrong. She called out to her husband a few more times, but the silence only heightened her anxiety. Then, she made a quick decision. She called emergency services. "My husband is home alone. He's not answering, but his dog is barking non-stop. Something is wrong. Please, send an ambulance." The 911 operator recognized the urgency in her voice and immediately dispatched a team to Tom Hanks's residence. Meanwhile, Thor remained by his owner's side, licking his face, trying to keep him conscious. Tom was still breathing, but the pain was unbearable. His heart was struggling, and he felt his body giving in to exhaustion. But before he lost consciousness completely, he saw Thor beside him, his eyes filled with concern. And for the first time, Tom realized that his dog wasn't just a companion. He was his guardian angel. Thor never left Tom's side for even a second. The dog's breathing was fast, his eyes locked onto his owner, who lay motionless on the living room rug. He sniffed Tom's face, licked his hands, desperately trying to bring him back. But Tom could barely keep his eyes open. The cell phone lay on the floor. The call now disconnected, but his wife had already done the most important thing. She had called for help. Now, everything depended on time, and time seemed to be working against Tom. He tried to take a deep breath, but his chest burned as if something were crushing him from the inside. His body felt heavy, his limbs numb. He wanted to move, but he couldn't. "Is this how it ends?" he thought, his mind growing foggy. But Thor wouldn't let him give up. The dog started barking again, loudly, insistently, as if trying to keep Tom awake. He pressed his snout against his owner's face, nudging him repeatedly. And then, a sound came from outside. Sirens. The paramedics were arriving. Thor ran to the door and barked desperately, scratching at the wood as if trying to open it himself. Outside, the ambulance came to a screeching halt at the entrance of Tom Hanks's house. 2 paramedics jumped out and rushed to the door, but it was locked. "We need to get inside," one of them shouted. Tom's wife, still on the phone with the emergency responders, heard the commotion. "He keeps a spare key under the flower pot on the porch." One of the paramedics quickly retrieved the key and within seconds unlocked the door. As soon as the door swung open, Thor bolted inside, running straight back to Tom, as if showing the paramedics exactly where to go. "He's over here," one of them called out, following the dog. The scene was alarming. Tom Hanks lay on the floor, his lips pale, his body covered in cold sweat. But he was still breathing, barely, but breathing. The paramedics moved swiftly. One knelt beside Tom, checking his vital signs, while the other prepared the oxygen mask. Weak pulse. Possible heart attack in progress. We need to get him to the hospital now. Thor stood close, watching every move. He was tense, but he didn't growl or try to stop anyone. He knew these people were there to help. As the paramedics lifted Tom onto the stretcher, Thor whimpered, trying to follow. "He wants to come with us," one of the paramedics observed. The other looked at the dog, whose eyes held a heartbreaking sadness. "Let's take him." It was rare for animals to be allowed inside an ambulance. But this wasn't just any dog. Thor was the reason Tom was still alive. The paramedics made space, and Thor immediately jumped inside, sitting beside his owner, watching closely as the medical team connected monitors and administered medication. The ambulance sped toward the hospital. Every minute was crucial, and Thor never took his eyes off Tom for even a second. The ambulance raced through the streets at full speed, its sirens piercing the quiet night. Inside, the paramedics worked quickly. One monitored Tom Hanks's vital signs, while the other prepared medication to stabilize his heart. "His blood pressure is dropping. We need to act fast," one of them warned. Thor, sitting in the corner of the ambulance, watched everything with wide, anxious eyes. He didn't understand the machines, the medical terms, or the gravity of the situation, but he knew something was terribly wrong. The dog moved closer, pressing his nose against Tom's hand. And then, something incredible happened. Tom's fingers twitched slightly, as if responding to his touch. The paramedics noticed. "He's still reacting. Let's keep him conscious." One of them took Tom's hand while the other administered a drug to help stabilize his heart. "Tom, can you hear me? You're on your way to the hospital." Tom's eyes flickered open for a brief second. His vision was blurry, but he recognized two things: the paramedics around him and, beside them, Thor, looking at him with the most concerned expression he had ever seen. Slowly, everything faded to black again, but he wouldn't give up. Not now. The ambulance arrived at the hospital. A medical team was already waiting at the emergency entrance. As soon as the doors opened, the paramedics rushed Tom inside. "Acute myocardial infarction, vital signs unstable. We need to get him to the emergency room now." Thor tried to follow, but a hospital security guard blocked his way. "Sorry, buddy, but you can't come in here." The dog barked, tried to push through again, but was stopped. He stood there, watching as his owner disappeared down the hallway. And for the first time that night, Thor was alone. He sat on the cold hospital floor, staring at the door where Tom had been taken. His eyes were sad, but his posture was firm. He wouldn't leave until he saw his owner again. Minutes later, Tom's wife arrived at the hospital. Her face was pale with worry, her eyes filled with tears. As soon as she entered the emergency room, the first thing she saw was Thor, sitting quietly, as if guarding the place. "Thor!" She rushed to him, kneeling down and hugging him tightly. The dog whimpered, resting his head on her shoulder. He could feel her distress, could sense that they were both facing the worst fear of their lives. "How is he?" she asked the first nurse she saw. "We don't know yet. The doctors are trying to stabilize him." Tom's wife sat beside Thor and ran her fingers through his fur, trying to calm herself. "You saved him, boy," she whispered, her voice breaking. And so, together, they waited for news that could change everything. Time seemed to crawl. Tom's wife remained in the waiting room, sitting beside Thor, who never took his eyes off the emergency room door. The dog was restless, his ears twitching at every sound of footsteps, every noise coming from the hallway. Hours passed slowly until, finally, a doctor appeared. "Mrs. Hanks?" She jumped to her feet, Thor standing beside her. "Yes, how is he?" The doctor gave her a small, tired but reassuring smile. "Your husband had a heart attack, but we managed to stabilize him. He underwent an emergency procedure and is now out of danger." Her eyes filled with tears. "He's going to be okay? He still needs rest and monitoring, but yes, he's conscious now." She let out a relieved sigh, covering her face with her hands as emotions washed over her. Thor, standing beside her, wagged his tail slightly, as if he too understood that his owner was safe. "Can I see him?" "Of course. But—" The doctor glanced at Thor. "The hospital doesn't allow animals in the ICU." Tom's wife looked down at the dog and then back at the doctor. "Doctor, this dog saved my husband's life. He has to see him." The doctor hesitated for a moment, but then smiled. "Just for a few minutes." Thor's tail wagged a little faster. He could sense the excitement in the air. He knew he was about to see Tom again. The hospital room was quiet, with only the soft beeping of monitors tracking vital signs. Tom Hanks lay in the hospital bed, looking pale but awake. When his wife walked in, he gave her a weak smile. "Hey." His voice was hoarse. She rushed to his side, taking his hand. "You scared me so much." Tom squeezed her hand lightly, exhausted but trying to reassure her. "I think I scared myself too." And then Thor walked in. The dog moved carefully toward the bed, as if he understood that his owner was still fragile. When he reached him, Tom looked at him and smiled. "Hey, buddy." Thor pressed his nose against Tom's hand, as if making sure he was really there. His eyes shone with emotion. Tom slowly ran his hand over the dog's head, feeling the familiar softness of his fur. "They told me you saved my life." Thor just stayed there, watching him. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here." The dog lay down beside the hospital bed, finally relaxing. He didn't need to worry anymore. His owner was safe. And at that moment, Tom realized something. Life is fragile. He had always known that, but he had never felt it so deeply. "I think this is a sign, isn't it?" he said, looking at his wife. "A sign that I need to slow down." She smiled gently, squeezing his hand. "Yes, Tom, you need to take care of yourself." He looked at Thor, who was now resting peacefully. "And you, my friend, you deserve the biggest steak as soon as we get home." His wife laughed, and Thor wagged his tail as if he understood the promise. In that hospital room, surrounded by machines and medicine, a simple truth became clear to Tom Hanks. Life is precious, and sometimes a guardian angel comes in the form of a Labrador named Thor. The following days were all about recovery. Tom remained in the hospital under observation, surrounded by doctors, nurses, and of course his wife, who never left his side. But whenever possible, Thor was allowed to visit him. And with each visit, Tom realized something new. At first, he only thought about how lucky he had been. If Thor hadn't been there, if he hadn't managed to alert his wife through the phone, if the paramedics had taken longer, maybe he wouldn't be here now. But over time, his perspective started to shift. He began reflecting on his routine, his choices, the fast-paced life he had lived for so many years. He had always taken care of his family, his friends, his fans, but what about himself? For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to look inward, and what he saw was a man who needed to slow down. One morning, as he gazed out of the hospital window, he smelled the coffee his wife had brought him. Something so simple, yet it brought him a different feeling. Thor lay at his feet, and as Tom looked at him, he smiled. "I think you tried to warn me before all this happened, didn't you?" he said, running his hand over the dog's head. Thor looked up at him with those deep, knowing eyes, and Tom knew the answer. "You always knew what I needed before I did?" Thor simply rested his head on Tom's lap, calm, as if saying, "Yes, and I always will." And right there in that simple moment, Tom made a decision. He wouldn't go back to living at the same pace as before. He still loved acting, telling stories, and pursuing his passion for film. But now he understood that life was made of small moments. Taking slow walks with Thor, having breakfast with his wife without rushing off to the next commitment, taking a deep breath and simply being present. Because in the end, these moments are what truly matter, and he wouldn't let them slip away again. The day of his discharge arrived. Tom Hanks put on comfortable clothes, adjusted his jacket over his shoulders, and looked at himself in the mirror. He was still a bit pale, a little thinner, but there was a different glow in his eyes. A glow of someone who now saw life from a new perspective. As he stepped out of his hospital room, he saw his wife waiting for him, and beside her, Thor, wagging his tail enthusiastically. "Ready to go home, buddy?" Tom crouched down carefully, running his hands through the dog's golden fur. Thor responded with a soft lick on his hand, as if to say, "I've never been more ready." As he left the hospital, he felt the fresh air touch his face. The sun shone in the sky, birds chirped, and every detail seemed more vivid than ever. He had always known life was precious, but now he felt it deeply. That night back home, Tom did something he hadn't done in a long time. He simply sat on the porch, a cup of tea in hand, gazing at the stars. Thor lay beside him, sighing contentedly. The silence was no longer unsettling. On the contrary, it was a reminder that he was here, alive, present, and he made a promise to himself. He would never ignore the signs from his body again. He would never put off what truly mattered, because life is made of moments, and thanks to Thor, he would have many more ahead. In the days that followed, Tom Hanks began seeing the world through a different lens. Every little action, every detail of his daily life now carried a deeper meaning. He realized how easy it was to get lost in the rush, in obligations, in the illusion that there would always be more time. For years, he had prioritized work and responsibilities above everything else, forgetting that his body also needed attention. But life had given him a second chance. And all because of Thor, the dog who, without any training for emergencies, relied solely on his instinct and saved him. Tom reflected on the purity of an animal's loyalty. Thor didn't wait for someone to tell him what to do. He felt that his owner was in danger and did everything in his power to help. How often do people overlook those who are truly by their side? How often do we take for granted the love of those who are there for us every single day? Thor had shown Tom that the true meaning of life lies in connection, in that attentive gaze that notices when something is wrong, in the silent companionship that offers support in difficult times, in the kind of loyalty that asks for nothing in return. Tom knew he couldn't go back to living the same way he had before. He decided to make changes, to take better care of his health, to cherish the simple moments, and most importantly, to never again fail to recognize the value of those around him. Life doesn't always give clear warnings. Sometimes the signs are subtle, a slight fatigue, the quiet concern of a watchful dog. But if we're willing to listen, those signs can save us. And in Tom Hanks's case, it was Thor who taught him that lesson in the most unexpected and powerful way. Because in the end, true love reveals itself in the hardest moments. And sometimes it comes from a four-legged friend. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment if you have a pet for more emotional and inspiring stories like this one. Tomorrow, we have another special story waiting for you.